This talk.
No!
Because nobody.
I deleted a sentence.
No. Okay.
Oh well.
All right, I gotta start.
I closed it and didn't save, and I'd written a sentence.
Okay, so since we have like different levels of musical experience here, I'm gonna start from like the very basics. And I'm not going to linger on it, but there's things that'll be good to know if you want to work with sound. So the first thing is, well, really basic. Sound is a wave, but it's not a wave that travels up and down as music programs or books make you visualize it. It's changing air pressure, basically. It's alternating change in air pressure, like there's a sound source. You have like denser parts, and then you will have less dense parts. And when you look at a visualization of a sound wave, it's actually measuring the density of the air, like the pressure of air, I should say. Those are very different. The pressure of air.
Don't visualizations show you like they mirror it, but it's not like in a sine wave. They show it to you like on a more flat thing.
No, that's actually visualization of like entire music is like that, but, or I should say, the ones you see that are really symmetrical, they're actually the same as this, but extremely compressed. So the amplitude is always the same. And so when you, well, not always the same, but amplitude doesn't change, fluctuate wildly. So when you see this for like, maybe like a 60 second clip, it'll look like, that's why it looks symmetrical, because it's just compressed down to very, very thin. Okay.
Well, yeah, so like, if you're in Audacity and you zoom in all the way, you'll see that.
Yeah, you'll see something like that. So basically that wave visualization is how, it's the easier way than like using this. It's basically a convenience, and can you guys all see it? I just changed channel, whatever.
You see the blue?
Can you guys all see like right here, or not? Okay. So, what was I going to say? So basically, that wave is the way that computer represents sound and music, specifically the .wave file format. Basically, it's just, wave basically just takes points of numbers at fixed intervals and then store it. But it's, the intervals are extremely frequent. Usually they store 44,100 samples per second, and each number they take is 24 bits. Well, if you choose 24 bits, sometimes 16 or 32. But basically, each minute clip of WAV file contains 60 times 44,000 times 24 bits of numbers. And that's why waves are huge. But that's why wave basically keep full fidelity, because first of all, you have 24 bits to represent the amplitude. And second of all, 44,000 samples per second can represent up to 2250 hertz of sound. And this is basically almost completely above our hearing range. Maybe like if you're a newborn baby, you can hear it, but we usually hear, or we usually lose our perception of extremely high-pitched sound later on in life. So you pretty much won't be able to hear this. So our range of hearing fits completely within the sampling rate of the sound in a WAV file. Does it make sense so far? Okay. No questions? Cool. So I'm gonna move on to stuff like MP3, and then I'll move on to MIDI. So MP3's compression algorithm is really, really complex. But basically how it works is it takes psychoacoustic models like, not like, well, yeah, of how you perceive sound. So let's say you have like some sort of guitar sound, and then you have, that's about this loud, this is amplitude. And then you have, somewhere along here you have a drum beat that basically covers it up. And in the wave file, it will look something like this, because the sounds get added to each other. But in terms of human hearing, when these drum beats happen, you can't really hear the guitar parts. So MP3 takes advantage of that by taking out other sounds when you have another really loud sound that masks what instrument was before it. And it takes other shortcut like that to take out like frequencies that you find difficult to hear. And at the end, it uses a lossless compression like a zip, something like a zip file or ARAR file would use to reduce the size down dramatically. But basically, many other audio file formats like AAC, OGG uses this kind of format to reduce the sound down. They just use different models of how humans perceive sound to compress the most without losing fidelity. So MIDI is probably the most different out of all these. So you've all like used MIDI, right? Seen MIDI. So you know how big those are compared to wave. A MIDI can be like, say, 24 kilobytes, whereas the wave might be as large as like, I want to say, 24 megabytes. It's really, really small. And the reason it's so small is because MIDI doesn't actually store the sound data when you look at waveforms. MIDI doesn't keep track of the numbers or even the frequency. Well, it keeps track of the pitch, but it doesn't keep track of where the sound is at fixed intervals. Instead, what it does looks kind of like this. You have we all seen a piano roll?
Draw
Yes?
one.
Draw one? Okay.
You ruin everything.
Wow.
By the way, I should say, if you haven't seen piano roll, raise your hand. Okay,
I saw
that's
one
much more effective.
20 minutes ago when you showed it to me.
Yeah. So, you know how a piano keyboard, let's say this is just an octave, it has some black keys, and the ones down here are white. So basically, a piano roll is your horizontal piano, not to scale.
Oh, I thought the piano was facing the other way.
No, you'll see why in a sec. These are supposed to be straight lines, etc. So basically what MIDI does is it keeps track of the time and it keeps track of when a note gets started and it keeps track of when the note ended. So MIDI will look something like this. Or I should say a MIDI track. So let's say the orange is one instrument. Let's say it's that's orange. Let's say it's the violin, and you have a green one. That's the piano. So basically what MIDI does is it keeps track of where each note starts, where each note ends, and it keeps track of the velocity, as in, velocity is slightly different from volume. It keeps track of volume, as in, it keeps track of how loud it should be, but velocity is correlated with loudness, but it also correlates with the sound. of the instrument, if you play a violin slowly, it'll sound very different than as you play it fast. Or, yeah, play it fast. So it keeps track of a velocity value, something between 0 and 128. And it also keeps track of pitch changes throughout that note. And quite a few other data, but these are the most important ones. So a MIDI usually has, well, there used to be a limit of 16 tracks, but now it's an arbitrary number of tracks. But you can basically visualize each instrument as a track. And each track can have its own notes. And
Can you play multiple notes at the same time?
yes, you can. You can play multiple notes per track. In fact, the MIDI specification, which I'll get to, requires that you can play up to something like 24 notes at the same time per channel, per track.
How many notes did old video game consoles let you play at a time? Do you remember?
A multiple of 2.
Like,
I'm guessing like 8 or 16. 4 would be really restricting.
I just remember hearing that it was super restricting.
Right. So,
If it was fun.
by the way, the reason that old consoles like SNES has such a characteristic sound is because it uses only 256 possible numbers to store the amplitude. So that's why you can't represent a very wide range of sounds. Whereas if you had a larger amplitude, a lot more space, you can like have crazy waveforms. When you have only 256, you can get a lot of nuance out of your sound, out of how much precision you have in storing the amplitude of the sound. So yeah, the MIDI handles the notes, whereas the computer handles actually what instrument to use. There's such a thing called the GM2, General MIDI specification. Basically, General MIDI 2 says that you have to have these instruments in your sound card, and it has to be labeled as such. So the first instrument is usually a piano, index 000. I don't actually know how many bits they use to keep track of the index, but piano. And then 0001 is usually another piano. And I think the first 6 are pianos, and then you go to, there are different pianos.
Guitar.
No, next you go to electric piano. I can show you guys later on. Electric piano, and then you go to harpsichord. So basically, all the keyed percussion instruments come first. And then you have, I think guitar comes next, string, but I'm not entirely sure. But it's like divided into sections, and they have more than just individual instruments. They have orchestral instruments. So one of the indexes would be like choir and another one would be choir O. And then you have, trying to think about it, like a string section could just be its own sound instead of one violin, one cello added together. So what they wanted to do with the general MIDI specification is to try to emulate as a wide range of possible sounds for composition as they can. Okay, question?
In MIDI, do they allow you to change the volume of a note while you're playing it? So like a fade in and a fade out effect? Or is it just very crude on or off?
It does allow you to change it. So in addition to note track, MIDIs also have, I'm just going to erase all of this. It has a volume track. So this is for the orange instrument. The green one, the piano, will get its own track. you can specify the volume changes separately. So you can, like at the very end, if you want this instrument to fade out, you can specify for the track
Oh, okay.
to go off right here. And if you want it to be quieter, you can lower it, but the notes themselves also have a volume track and a velocity track. It's just that you can't change the volume or the velocity halfway within a note. You have to do it throughout the entire track. Anyways, so general MIDI, I think it's 128 instruments that try to cover basically everything you can compose, but it's very simplistic sounding. And the GM specification doesn't actually say exactly what the instrument will sound like. It just gives you a list of index and which instruments should be associated with it. So you can have a device that also follows the general MIDI, but you'll have a different piano sound associated with piano 1, and etc. So that's the MIDI format. Any questions? No questions. Okay, this is going to relate more to composing without the MIDI restriction. Oh, right, the other thing. How the sound gets to the speaker in a computer. So the speaker takes sound data much like a wave. If you play an MP3 file, you'll be unzipped and you'll be decompressed into the wave. You'll be decompressed in memory into what looks like the wave file format.
I thought you made it sound like it decompresses the file and it magically comes out as a wave, sound wave.
Well, it comes out as a dot wave.
Okay.
So you have an
Oh.
wow. So you have an MP3 sound file, and I'm not sure if it stores the I think it stores the frequency instead of the amplitude, which makes it store less. But in the end, whether you're playing like OGG, ACC, AAC, MP3, whatever file format you use, they're going to end up looking the same as the wave file format. In the very end.
So your sound card converts it on the fly while you're reading?
Well,
Or something like
yeah, I think your sound card depends on whether you have a sound card.
Okay.
I think sometimes CPU does work.
The operating system.
Yeah. So that's just something to keep track of if you ever like want to make an audio engine. Everything gets converted in what looks like a wave. Right. The next thing, and this is going to come in later because sound cards do something that reduces the latency of converting everything. And when I talk about sound cards, this is going to tie in. So the exact representation of an instrument. So who has heard the sine wave? The sound of a sine wave.
At what pitch?
At what pitch? At any pitch.
Maybe. Wanna play?
I probably do have a sine wave here.
Is it that annoying like thing that people use on their cell phones in class?
That probably is a sine wave, just because that's the simplest. Yeah, can you change it to your duck?
Also, but then we have your wireless mouse.
Oh, no need. In case you're interested, the sine wave is also in the MIDI specification, I think.
I think you have to push another button.
What?
Here's the sine wave.
What?
You must construct additional pylons. That was going on there.
sine wave.
Just
Okay.
goes back to
So I mean, if your TV ever like stop receiving signal, that's what you hear.
What's that?
So a sine wave is what it self-explanatory, just a sine wave. But most instruments don't look like that. In fact, nothing in real life really produces a sine wave sound. It's just a mechanical sound. What sounds look more similar to is, I can't really reproduce what a real sound is.
you could use your microphone.
So this just looks like two sine waves got added together, but assume this is like more complex than it looks. So real instruments have these like small hills in a sense. They're much more nuanced than your average sine wave. And that's basically what an instrument is. An instrument is just a sample of a cycle of the sound. And the number of times you repeat that cycle in a second will give you whatever pitch you want to play that sound at. So the instrument, I'm going to use an easier instrument. The instrument saw wave looks like this. And if I were to change the instrument here to saw wave, just gonna not use those ones. So the computer represents the sine wave basically through what a fixed sample of saw wave looks like. So keep track of the amplitude at fixed intervals on this saw wave. And when you say, now play the middle A, you'll take the sample and you'll repeat it 440 times per second in order to produce this entire, I guess, sound. Well, you shouldn't do that. In order to produce the sound you hear playing the saw wave. So this is basically what sampling is. If you want to create your own instruments, one way you can do is to synthesize. Some synthesizers will give you like a cosine wave at the very beginning, and then you can modify this wave to, it should just be one cycle, to what you want it to look like. So you can be like, well, I want to have this kind of, this shape in my sound. And then you can save it as an instrument, and then when you try to play it at the middle A, you'll play this 440 times a second to give you the sound you want.
Have you done that before?
Yes, but synthesizing is really, it's very deep because there's not really an intuition between what the wave looks like and what you hear. So the saw wave doesn't really have it doesn't really have a sharp sound. It's just what the saw wave does is to make that sound. But when you hear it, you can't really possibly visualize that it looks like this unless you already know that it's a saw wave.
Can you make a recording and turn it into an instrument?
Right, that's what sampling is. So to get instruments, you can either synthesize or sample. And sampling is basically you have whatever sound you want to produce, and you know how to do it in real life. I don't know, you hit a box with a ruler or something.
Or you sing a note.
Or you sing a note. Make some sort of weird looking sound. And the computer records it, and then you can tell the computer to play it back at certain frequencies in order to basically play all the notes with just one sound. And that's basically what large commercial sound producing companies do. They have these really good instruments, basically, I don't know, really expensive piano and violins, and they have professionals play it in a really clean recording setting. And they do multiple samples, and then they layer the samples on top of each other to produce a very realistic sound. But what I want to say out of this is really for you to see what an instrument looks like in a computer. Synthesizing and sampling are their own art. So try it only if you have time. What's next? Use my mouse. I'm not using the TV yet.
You can make a bunch of samples of just you saying la la la. You play it back and be like, la.
Wait, since some of you haven't seen the piano roll, let me show you real fast. Oh yeah. So this is a music editor that I always use. It's not free, sadly.
What's it called?
It's called Sonar. Well, this is Sonar Lite Edition. It came with the external hard drive, not the external hard drive, external sound card.
Just buy an external hard drive that came with that.
That I got.
Is that a repeating background image? Because on the back there?
So I took the Castle soundtrack from A Link to the Past. And so these are individual tracks. And I just got this off a website. And a single track looks, well, this is all the tracks. A single track looks something like this, and I can expand it. So up here, the sound editor gives you the measures, and this is 4 beats per second, well, 4 beats per measure. So the subdivisions are by 4s. And if I play this, oh, that's really loud. I can show maybe track 3 or something like this. And this is not a trombone, it's actually a trumpet. But you can tell that it's playing one of the trumpet that plays in the background by just looking at the notes. If I show off them at once. Oops. So these are different instruments layered on top of each other. And down here you can actually see this is the velocity bar. And specifically there are some, this is not the right one. There are some pitches in the sound that are bent. And they're from, I want to say this one. Oh, I soloed this track, so now you're only hearing this solo. Let's start at the very beginning, and
What did you do to
let me try to find which instrument has a pitch bend. Oh, I think it's this one. So go to this instrument number 4. And here you can see that the pitch of the entire track got altered down here. So it's playing, first of all, it's playing normally, but it starts going down in pitch to produce, I guess, a richer sound. Right. So this is what basically any music, most music editors will show you a MIDI editing track. So the reason that MIDI ties into music creation in general is that the piano roll is a very effective way of representing music. When you have multiple instruments and you want them to play, at like certain intervals and layer on top of each other, the piano roll is a very effective way of showing you visually what the sound is, what the music is doing. It's a very useful way to compose. You can just add new notes. That's what it sounds like. Yeah. It's hard to make music with sound.
Ooh, they don't appreciate you, man. I don't know.
So, basically, every single music editor pretty much doubles as a MIDI editor because they all have the piano roll anyway. This is huge. But what music editors let you do is to use plugins that contain custom sounds. And these plugins have extensions like sf.sf something. It could be Z or A or something. But they usually begin with SF for sound font. And then there's .vst or .vsti. And it's like, this one I think is virtual sound.
Is that a capital V?
Something. Yeah, that's a capital V.
A capital letter in a.
So virtual instrument of some kind. And there's .dxi, which is very similar to VST. Basically, .sf are primarily instrument files. If you open a sound font, it's basically an index, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, containing samples of sounds that your program can utilize to play instruments that are defined by these sound fonts. VST and VSTR are similar, except that they are really plugins. They're not just a data bank. They could be like really any type of application having a graphical user interface, and they have these knobs you can tweak to change the sound, and they might have some preloaded sounds. But other VSTs could just be synthesizers. And what you can do with VST is you can have your music editor send sound data to the VST, and the VST will take the note and process it and output the sound that these settings are configured to play. DXI is similar. It's also a plugin. It's just kind of a competing file format. So I have this down here that I use to change my instrument is a VST. And this VST actually conforms to the GM2 sound specification, GM2 MIDI specification. So pianos are all at the very beginning, and they have chromatic percussion, or again, I guess guitar comes later. So what's convenient about this is when you take a MIDI file and you don't like the Windows default MIDI sounds, you can hook it up to the VST, and since the index are all matched up, you'll play the sound with the correct instrument, but different sounds, possibly better sounds. So you heard the MIDI version of this Castle track. Oh, that's the wrong one. Wait, did I change something? Okay. So this is the MIDI instruments. The audio track I have down here is basically what this plugin would output when I put the MIDI sounds into this plugin. So what to do is switch between the two. I have it muted right now so you can't hear it, but wait, that didn't do anything. I gotta switch back. So
What exactly does that plugin do?
the plugin is basically a bank of sounds that you can utilize instead of the default MIDI sounds. So these instruments, like this piano here,
They sounded a lot smoother,
they sound a lot smoother.
less crude.
That's because I have it on mute. You know what? Let me just- So this is much smoother. This is just preview. These are much smoother than the MIDI sounds. And basically a big part of the sound industry is to race and see who can get the better, more realistic sounds out there. The other thing that this VST lets you do is to tune the sounds. So I have this. There are parameters up here you can adjust to change the sound. It doesn't give you as much freedom as a synthesizer would do, but say this character, I have no idea what it does, but it changes the sound. It doesn't sound too. The envelope here I can describe later on, but this one is much more intuitive than the other ones. Oh, you can also have vibrato. I forgot about that.
No wobble.
And also up here you have reverb. This one says chorus. Basically, chorus give you the effect of multiple instruments playing at once. Reverb gives you kind of a echo effect. Basically, the more reverb you have, the more spacious the track seem to be. The sound seem to be. So if you want to create the sound of music playing in like a large music hall, you will turn the reverb up quite a bit. Oh, and pan is sound channel, but you can't really hear the difference from here. Basically, if you turn it all the way to the left, then only the left speaker will make that sound, and if you turn it all the way to the right, otherwise. So yes. Any questions regarding VSTs? No? Okay. So the things I haven't shown, SF and DXI. DXI, as I said, is pretty much similar to VSTs. For sound fonts, they're not really used anymore, but what's good about sound fonts is you can get them for free very often because it's a really old format, and back then people like make sound fonts that they share with each other. They just go online and be like, this is a piano sound font, use it. And you can just use it. So yeah, you can still get pretty realistic, like an orchestra sound font that could produce something that sounds really polished, and it will still be free. Whereas for VSTs and DXIs, companies make sound packs, but they're usually really expensive, especially the ones that like took a lot of sampling to get.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah.
So I came in a little late, but this is about creating an engine that creates sounds, right?
No, it's just about creating music,
Okay.
but it has a lot of technology stuff going into it.
It's not about creating your own sounds, like from like a very sort of ground, like from the ground up, right?
It's
Like-
about electronic music.
Electronic music, yeah. So music, not sound, in the sense that it's not really directed toward making sound effects,
Yeah.
but much more pertaining to music. Yeah, let's see.
Tyler, is this how you make your electronic music?
So yeah, the MIDIs, you can find a ton of them online. And basically, do you want to compose this way? And this is how most composers compose, unless they like do the old-fashioned write it down on music paper. You basically get a sound editor, and if you're okay with starting out with MIDI instruments, you can just use those MIDI instruments. But if you want to get more polished sounds, then you look for VSTs or you look for sound fonts online, or you purchase them, and you basically do a hookup and compose your music this way. There's another component to it, which is remixing, and not in the sense that you're like remaking a piece of music, but basically adjusting the track before you go to mastering. And these are basically post-processing. You compose your thing. You compose your music to create a sound file.
So does mixing mean anything as opposed to remixing?
Um,
Different contexts it does, like
Mixing.
when you do all the equalization stuff, sometimes referred to as mixing.
Right, I think mixing and remixing in this context are pretty similar. Actually, I think they just call it mixing, not remixing. Just mixing. Remixing is actually remaking the song, but not remaking, but changing the
Taking
equalizer.
a song and moving stuff.
But-
changing stuff.
Yeah, to the bare bones, basically what mixing is you have your music and it has like 10 tracks in it. And then you divide it into 4 groups or whatever arbitrary amount of groups you want. And then you export it as some sort of sound file. Wave is usually the one. And then you send it to a program that does the mixing. And it basically lets you juxtapose the tracks and change the equalizer or compress the sounds individually to a very bare bone level. And this is basically to get the parts you want to stand out. So if during the compositional process your your percussion is too heavy, then if you have a percussion track, you can send it to mixing, and mixing can take care of trying to make it fit better and tone it down. And to an extent, that's what mastering is too.
What's the
But-
difference?
So mastering, the process of mastering also includes, well, there's usually a in order. It's called a mastering chain. Basically, they can still take individual sounds, but sometimes they take just the entire song in one track and they send it first. First is usually equalizer, which, who doesn't know what an equalizer is? Cool. Okay.
I've seen them, but I don't really know what they are.
So really quick, equalizer. So equalizers usually look something like this. And basically, you have your lower sounds, the bass, on the side, and you have your higher sounds. I don't know what to call them. Just higher sounds. But pitch. And you basically adjust the amplitude of each pitch. So you have an entire wave file, and it converts your wave file into, and this is really crudely speaking, they usually do a lot of things to make it still sound good, even if you like dramatically change these. They turn the wave file into several different pitch bands. So if you turn this one up to up here maybe, then these will get amplified. As a result, when this wave file is put back together, I'll hear the bass part more, and etc. If you tune the middle one, then the middle part of the band, which is presumably something like probably like mid-upper range of your piano, or the mid-range of your piano, will get turned up. So things like that. Basically, it's just to also to get the parts to sound good together. If something that is high pitched gets too loud, then you want to tune it down. Equalizer and then compressor. Compressor, basically, I'm trying to make a compressor tones down the harshness of your sound by evening out some of the like very jagged edges in your sound waves. So yeah, something like that's like super weird looking and it sounds not very good because it's so jagged, then the compressor will try to even it out. And that's also kind of an art because if you do it too much, your sound might lose its like texture.
It might sound fake.
Yeah, it might sound fake. But it's useful because when you're composing, often you're not just taking your sound sources from just one VST, from just one company. So if you have sounds coming from like different VSTs or different companies or different synthesizers, they might not mesh very well together. And using a compressor, you can get the sound to work together better. And the last one is a limiter. And different people have different orders. There's a few more things that people use here that I'm not going to go into, partly because I don't know either. A compressor basically changes the amplitude of your sound. So let's say up here is the maximum amplitude that the computer would accept. So like in the CD industry, they put a limit on how loud your soundtracks can be. And once you're above this limit, they just like cut you off because they don't want the sound to be too loud.
So
But
flat line.
yeah, they'll cut it out. It's called brick walling because you like can hear the brick wall here.
Draw every break.
Right. So during these process, it's pretty often that your sounds will get like not loud enough. So what the limiter does is, well, or it could be too loud. And a sound editor allows you to go like above the whatever standard that the CD or whatever industry sets. But you want to change the loudness of your track. So you either tone it down or you expand it so that you can get an acceptable level of amplitude or loudness of on your track when you export it. So yeah, that's that. Any questions in that regard? No? Okay.
5 minutes left.
Yeah. So that's pretty much all I have in terms of materials I prepared. But if there's any questions, like, any questions? Any question will work. Okay.
So if you were
Okay.
trying to compose a song, where would you start?
Right.
Because you have like these weird instruments on this piano.
PTS one. So the instruments there are not really so weird because it provides most of the everyday instruments you'll need. I will look for a digital audio workstation, which is what Sonar is. Because you kind of have to have one to get started. And they all have pretty significant learning curve. It's basically like Photoshop, except
Words.
not worse, but in music there's a huge amount of competitors. So there's like 5 or 6 versions of Photoshop you can choose from, basically, from competing companies that have their different style.
So there is no like go-to program that everyone would.
Right, but the starting point is just to get one, and then to play around with making your own tracks through the piano roll. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can just be one single track. When I got started, that's how I made my tracks.
Does Audacity do anything like this?
Audacity doesn't have piano roll.
No.
It's
What-
not really for composing.
What is it used for?
Audacity,
If you just
yeah,
win
it's
the
used for editing.
editing.
Like
you import
cutting.
a sound and you do stuff to it, and then you export it back.
So what I said about mixing and mastering, all of those stuff you can do with Audacity, but not really the composing part.
Wait,
Yeah,
Patrick?
probably like one of the, probably like a good free tool that has a lot of the functionality that Zooming's shown here is probably GarageBand if you have a Mac.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
GarageBand.
It's pretty much free on the Mac to begin with, so
I've
it
seen
pretty much has all this
the piano rolls
functionality.
for the first time in GarageBand.
Yeah, GarageBand is a good place to start. There's a few other ones. Don't worry about it.
Speaker.
Nope.
Pretty sure.
The same audio.
It's my instant messaging thing. Podium is one that's free. I'm trying to think of other ones. LMMS. I mean, there's a list on Wikipedia you can look up, or you can just search for which ones are free. There's quite a few lists online that I found for free digital audio workstations. But the process is to get one and then start, basically try out composing, mess around with it. And when you feel the need to go beyond the MIDI instruments, try to find some sounds that you want to use.
Are there any
And
web
go from there.
communities that you
Um, I don't really
You can
use
find-
any specific web communities. There's a ton of audio forums online, like for composers.
Forum.
Not specifically
Oh,
composer,
forum.
but forums. Forums.
You said forum.
Forums, and you can basically find a lot of threads talking about where to get the free VSTs, where to get free SFs, stuff like that. And there's quite a few of them that conform to the GM2 standard. So if you can find one, you can just map your pre-made MIDI file with the instrument. You don't really have to do anything extra to get a better sound out of it. Okay.
So, if you don't have like a musical keyboard like that, you just have to like click on everything.
Yeah, you kind of, yeah.
Unless they have a built-in like
Yeah, I
keyboard
mean-
controls, but
Oh, convert it to QWERTY keyboard.
Yeah, you can do that. And some VSTs have.
If you go to any of the Oscar labs or on campus, they've got keyboards that you can check out with your CAD card. And then you can just sit down on one of the Macs they've got and the Mac's dual boot to Windows and Mac also, so.
So cool.
covered, man. as long as you're a student.
Club
covered.
trick to an Oscar.
So something like this has its own virtual keyboard that you can use. It's definitely not as handy as this. This is hooked onto a different instrument. That's why it sounds lame. But
Gorgeous.
Play the song, Tom.
what?
Or one of the songs.
Wait. Wait.
Wait.
Wait.
Wait.
Dun, 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 dun. Oh no, I'm not at the right place. Anyways, these are really handy to have, and we have one in this room that we just found. So, so if you want to use it,
It was like unopened.
yeah, it was unopened.
It
but
was
we
like it
opened
just
it.
magically appeared in this room.
Yeah, it's basically some higher up entity telling you to use this, in my opinion. So yeah, it's really handy to have one of these. I think this is like $75 or something, so it's like kind of a money investment, but I think it's very useful. And the bigger ones usually come with a pitch wheel, so when you play a note, you can like turn the wheel to have it go lower pitch or higher pitch. So yeah, if you want to be serious about composing, you do need one. But if you're just trying it out, it's not really super necessary. And usually, like, the interfaces are not that bad once you get used to it. I just closed it. Nice. So when I go into the editor interface, it's pretty easy to manipulate a note.
Whoa.
And it plays the sound that you're currently on, which helps a lot if you don't have a MIDI keyboard.
Some lower ones.
Lower ones?
Now play.
Play it off.
You want to play it?
Doom is coming.
Yeah, Link's like, where
It's not coming. This is not really a composing talk. So I think that's that, if you don't have any more questions.
Good.